Hi, everybody. My name is Stefan Wood. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Law, Society and Sustainability at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC. I'm an environmental lawyer and researcher. It's hard not to come out of a film like this just feeling depressed and down. It's such a huge problem and a huge challenge. I'll say a few remarks about what sorts of things can be done through legal systems to address a problem like this, but I think it's important to remember that what we're talking about is a pretty fundamental societal and market transformation of systems of production and consumption, and that's not something that law can impose. At the most, law can work at the margins. I'm sure Neve will have things to say about what human rights law can do. But the one thing I'll say is, just from the perspective of Canada, the approach that Canada has taken to issues like this is, on the one hand, treating the problem of electronic waste, electronic devices, really as a waste management problem. And it's really looking at the wrong end of the problem. We have to think about it more as a problem about regulating production and trade and consumption. And maybe as we go forward, I'll have a few ideas about the way that different levels of government in Canada can, pick away at the edges of the problem. There are some relatively small and somewhat larger things that governments can do that they aren't doing presently, and I'd be happy to chat about those as we go forward.
Hi, I'm Jeff Shantz. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Critical Criminology Working Group, and we started the working group. It's made up of faculty, students, and community members, in part because we recognize that that criminology's work is oftentimes misguided and misgiven, much like the criminal justice system is. That is, they spend too much time looking at fairly low-level, less harmful activities, victimless crimes, low-level property offenses, things like that, rather than looking at the real sources of social harm in our society. And when we talk about the real sources of social harm in our society, we see some of these examples in the film. We're talking about corporate crime, we're talking about state crime, we're talking about activities of economic and political power holders. And so our work has been, as community organizers and community members, to try and bring sort of a criminological lens to some of these more harmful social activities, and to say that if criminologists are really serious about the work that they're doing, that this is where we should be putting our focus, not on the sort of low-level activities, less harmful activities that get conceptualized as street crime. And when we look at some of the things that we've seen in the movie, for example, I mean, we're talking about things that fit a sort of a criminological definition of crime, unnecessary, avoidable activities that cause unnecessary harm. And they're the result of specific conscious decisions that are being made to cut costs, especially to cut labor costs, right? Basic exploitation, right? Labor costs down, profits up, and then through, largely because they're able to offload other costs onto the public. And this is where the state comes in too, right? So in more conventional terms in criminology students are always kind of inclined to look to the state for solutions, regulation or oversight or whatever. And in these cases, of course, the state is not only acting in an incompetent or bumbling fashion, but it's typically complicit. It's complicit in creating the conditions that allow this to happen and to be continually reproduced over time. And that's because of the close relationship that state actors have with corporations, and in terms of funding and support for campaigns, but even in terms of the sort of worldview, right? So governments creating policies that allow corporations to move around, and then making communities sort of hostage to corporations coming in and saying, well, we'll show you some jobs in the next election, but you have to give us a break here or cut regulation there or not hold us accountable for cleanup and things like that. So I think hopefully part of the discussion we have will be around those sort of systemic issues. I mean, we're talking about capitalism when it gets right down to it, right?
I guess you can keep that one. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Neve, and I'm the Secretary General of Amnesty International here in Canada. And first and foremost, I want it to be known, not that there's anyone here who's likely to buy me a birthday gift, but I want one of those gorgeous wooden laptops. Absolutely. Obviously, that documentary is a wrenching eye-opener. I saw it for the first time. I actually watched it on YouTube this morning just to kind of give myself an introduction to it before coming here, and I had my eyes opened, and I feel like I know a lot about quite a few injustices and concerns around the world, but it certainly was an eye-opener for me to really understand that side of the electronic devices world. And we see in the documentary why that's the case. There's been so much secrecy, so much attempt to keep this hidden, including around the lawsuits that a number of brave survivors and family members of victims have brought forward. But also there's obviously just the fact that we, of course, and I include myself in the we, don't want to face this possibility. We're so tethered to those devices, and you saw it, didn't you, in all of those remarks of, oh yes, I get a new one every 6 months. I'm not quite that bad, but I certainly do. And I was thinking, oh yeah, where are mine, in what desk drawers? That's true. But there's an unwillingness, therefore, an uncomfortableness about having to confront something that is such an integral part of our lives in so many respects. And those of us doing social justice work, it's an incredible social justice tool, isn't it? So it's not surprising that it hasn't come out in the ways that it needs to, and clearly that has to be the next phase of campaigning and work around this. I want to add a couple of dimensions to it. One is, I don't think this did come out all that strongly in the documentary, but this absolutely, at its heart, is a human rights issue, and I think there's a lot of reasons why it's valuable to frame it as that. It takes us into the realm of accountability and remedies, et cetera, when we really start talking about it as a human rights issue. Amnesty has been doing some related work. If there was sort of that global map of going back and forth between the US and China, et cetera, if this went on for another 15 minutes, there could have been another stop that took us to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's huge concerns about cobalt mining. Amnesty has a 2-year campaign underway with respect to the vast array of human rights abuses, right up at the top of the list being child labor associated with cobalt mining. Well, many of you will know that cobalt is an essential ingredient in the lithium batteries that are so essential to keeping our phones and laptops and tablets, and even more beyond that, we're getting into electric cars and all that kind of stuff going. And there has been no awareness, no efforts by exactly the same companies. I was listening to the companies they're talking about. They're the same companies that are featuring prominently in our campaigning. And at the end of the day, it comes down to a lot of the same issues. I mean, time and again, you heard people in that documentary talking about supply chain, supply chain, supply chain. Know your supply chain. Regulate your supply chain. Due diligence with respect to your supply chain. That's certainly what we're saying with respect to the cobalt issues, and it clearly is central here. I think we also need to absolutely be focused on ensuring that companies are now going to be held accountable for all the harm they did, let alone the harm that we don't want them to be doing in the future. There needs to be redress and compensation for that. And third, there obviously is a crucial role for governments here in imposing some clear legal obligations, including around supply chain due diligence on companies. And that includes our own government here in Canada. The last thing I want to highlight, and this didn't come out in the documentary, but I'm sure all of you share my absolute deep respect and admiration for Ma Jun and Jia Hao, the environmental activist who began the documentary and the pediatrician who ended the documentary. Now, we didn't get a sense in the documentary as to whether either of them have experienced repercussions or harassment or danger because of their obviously very brave work in China. But we know from our human rights work that activists like those two amazing individuals are amongst the most imperiled human rights defenders around the world right now. Human rights defenders doing work around environmental issues, land issues, contamination, etc. And I think that's one other piece we need to keep in mind as we're figuring out how we move forward with this, because we need to be sure that heroic individuals like that continue to have the space and safety to bring this information to our attention.
Thanks. First, I want to say what a pleasure it is to see my old colleague Alex Neve here. Many, many years working together in Amnesty International. I've moved on from my position there, but it's really nice to come together again. Just following up on a couple of things that have been said. One with respect to attacks on environmental rights defenders. Last summer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders had as the focus of his report to the United Nations attacks on environmental human rights defenders, because they are at such risk. When you think about the amount of money that is at stake by those who are profiting off of what we saw, it's really a sad commentary that then governments are complicit often in attacks on people who are trying to protect human rights and working against the sorts of things that you saw in the film. Another point I wanted to make is you could almost call this film Death by Design and Denial, right? So we heard the denials by the companies, or Apple, well, we won't talk about that. And there's also denial by states, by governments. And the importance of working against impunity by taking on the responsibility of states for the acts of companies over which they do have regulatory authority, I think is very, very important. Now, in international human rights law, when it comes to treaties that have been ratified, there's traditionally been this concept that, it just applies to what governments are doing within their own territory. However, in fact, one of the things that was a passion of mine when I was the legal director of Amnesty International in London was making sure that we worked for state responsibility for non-state actor misconduct. And just last week, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights handed down an extremely important advisory opinion on the subject of the responsibility of states for environmental harm that takes place outside their territorial boundaries due to actors over which they have either direct control or even regulatory control. And that's a huge step in the right direction, and I think we're going to see the impact of that playing out. And I just wanted to highlight that really significant development from this past week.
Thank you, panelists. So this documentary encompassed so many different things, from labor exploitation, health and safety concerns, environmental injustice. And, to sum up all of those things, at the height of that was really corporations prioritizing profit over people. And I think that's something to critically think of as we continue this discussion. So we can open this up for questions and comments from the audience. Please raise your hand. A runner will come to you with a microphone. We'll try to maintain a speaker's list.
Thank you. My name is Douglas Kook. I come from the Quesnel River watershed and have been dealing with the Imperial Metals Mount Poly mine disaster. Actually, Imperial Metals Mount Poly mine ever since it was first proposed. This is the largest toxic tailings spill in Canadian history and in the top 3 in the world. As we speak, the wintertime, massive amounts of heavy metals, mercury, laden in those ground up Mount Poly is making its way through Quesnel Lake, down Quesnel River into the Fraser River, and coming to a Salish Sea beach near you. There's been no sanctions, no charges, no fines. We just had our provincial government last week basically put a stay on the 3-year or on any provincial laws pertaining to the Mount Poly disaster. exempting it from any chance of provincial charges with regards to what happened. We couldn't believe that. We kept that in play because as citizens, Bev Sellers, a former chief of the Hatsul First Nation, kept it in play as of August 4th, 2017. But the provincial government chose not to uphold any of the regulations or laws that pertain to Canada's largest toxic tailings spill, mining spill. I'm very thankful that Amnesty International is here and yourself, because Amnesty has been one organization that has helped out local people and First Nations there in terms of seeing this go further. Anyway, I'd like to get some possible suggestions in terms of what we might be able to do, even in terms of supposedly our own regulations and laws when our governments don't even back them up.
Thank you for the shout out at the end. As you've noted, and this is very, very important to Amnesty International, the Mount Polly disaster is of grave concern to us. And again, because it isn't only, it absolutely is an environmental disaster, a public health disaster, it's an affront to Indigenous peoples and many other concerns. But it is a human rights crisis, absolutely, and that's the frame we've brought to it. I'm sure you're familiar with, but I'll let other people know that Amnesty did put a report out on this, sort of assessing the human rights dynamics of the Mount Polly crisis almost a year ago now. I guess what I can offer is that we're going to continue to stand with you. And we too were crushingly disappointed by the BC decision recently, but that's not the end of anything for us. And we clearly need to continue to push on both the level of accountability with respect to what happened around this disaster, and then secondly, the kinds of lessons that need to be learned, reforms that need to be instituted. You know, we've supported the call for there needs to be a public inquiry into mining legislation and regulation in this province. Those sorts of developments need to go forward so that we can make sure there aren't more Mount Pollys. One of the places of real focus for us right now is the United Nations. We and others brought it to the attention of a major UN Human Rights Committee in August when they were reviewing Canada's human rights record, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the fact that it's had such impact on Indigenous peoples was the hook into that committee. And this is very notable. They were so gravely concerned about what they heard with respect to Mount Polly that they identified that situation as one of only a handful of issues coming out of that review that they think are so grave that they've insisted they want to hear back from Canada within a year regarding progress. That'll come up in August. Canada has to report back to the UN as to what they've done to address the concerns that are obviously close to your heart and that were of real concern for that UN committee. That's not all that far away. That's still a number of months, and clearly all we're seeing is continued setbacks. It's sort of defies understanding to imagine what encouraging news Canada's going to be able to go back to the UN with in August, but that's sort of one of the next critical advocacy moments for us.
I would just add that every resident of Canada has the right to lay charges for violation of regulatory or criminal offenses and prosecute them privately. It's something that comes down from the common law tradition in England and isn't available in many countries. And from what I've seen, there's no doubt that the Mount Polly disaster involved violations of the Federal Fisheries Act at a minimum, not to mention many other laws. The private prosecution is a route that citizen groups can go and have used successfully in other provinces. What makes BC different than many provinces is that the BC provincial government has a long-standing practice going back decades of stepping in and staying private charges, which is, to me, an assault on democratic rights and an outrage, and people should make it known that this is outrageous for the provincial government to do. If they're not willing to prosecute charges, they should at least let interested citizens prosecute those charges. The other thing that it illustrates for me is what the sorts of effects you get when you have an absence of legally protected environmental rights, which is the case in British Columbia. Some provinces have environmental bills of rights, BC doesn't. Often these are just procedural rights, but they can, as opposed to a substantive right to a healthy environment, but even a procedural right to complain about violations can have impacts. If you had the right to demand an investigation of alleged violations, that can be part of broader activism and publicity campaigns. And ultimately, with all of these issues, governments respond to lots of noise, right? And the more noise that can be made by the people, the more likely it is to get some kind of legal action, whether it's enforcement of existing laws or changes, introduction of new laws, which is also a possibility in this area.
And not to speak directly to the case that you've raised, but I think just in addition to some of the things that have been said, when we think about more broadly addressing these sorts of impactful and destructive activities, we need to bear in mind as well the histories of direct action that communities have taken when they identify harmful activities to try and stop them. And we can think about the histories of workplace direct action carried out by workers who were concerned about the processes that they were involved in, stopping production, sabotage, slow down, those kinds of things, to bring about change in their communities, in industrial processes, in mining communities. We can think about direct actions that are being taken currently by a number of communities, indigenous communities, around the development of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, for example, and really important, crucial work, for example, being done by the Kwantlen First Nation in actually building structures that would impede the building of that pipeline, as was done around the Northern Gateway pipeline as well. So I think we need to create a space too where we can consider these as reasonable and responsible and effective responses, rather than allowing corporations and states to construct those activities as illegal, criminal, destructive, and so forth, right? We need to be able to work to create a context, a social context, a community context, where those sorts of activities are understood and respected. And we know when we talk about the state response to land defenders. For example, we've done some access, and different groups have done access to information requests, getting documents from the RCMP, and the RCMP very clearly in those documents. On the one hand, it's kind of interesting because the RCMP is actually a climate change denial organization. You read their documents, and you could be reading something from Trump administration in terms of they don't actually believe that climate change is real, and they don't believe that it's caused by humans. So they have all this so-called climate change. It's really quite incredible stuff. But the other thing you read in those documents is the way in which they construct community organizing, community activists, and specifically indigenous land defenders, right? They refer to them as terrorists, right? So we have to openly contest and oppose those sorts of constructions and mobilize for a better understanding of why direct action happens and the meaning of direct action and where the real destruction is coming from that direct action is trying to stop.
Thank you. Three very, very brief points. The first Apple computer in 1975, when Steve Wozniak made it, and then Steve Jobs comes in afterwards, but they actually put it in a wood case. It was what was affordable. It's what these two guys could do with a little bit of startup money. And that was it, 300 computers in a wooden case, the Apple, what becomes the Apple I. I have a BlackBerry 9900, and having, of course, never watched this film 10 years ago because it wasn't made, I choose not to upgrade. And I'm able to function with it. It's fine. And the rest of my life that I can't do with this, I just wait a few minutes till I get to a regular computer and catch up. It's not a big deal. This movie is as much about supply chains as anything else. And something that we each can do is educate ourselves about rare earth elements. What I learned is that the Chinese government made a conscious decision that they would become what oil is to OPEC or to Saudi Arabia or to Alberta, rare earth elements, and China would be, that's the position they would stake. And as I learned that 100, not 99.9, 100% of all electronics must have some of the rare earth elements. And China, over 30 years, has become the 100% market supply chain controller, owner of rare earth elements. So Canada, we had a few companies that were in it, and we lost those companies. They bought them, and they relocated their technology to China. We've actually lost control of our own rare earth elements, and we're a very large country when it comes to elements. So what the hell can we do? What's not in the film is cars. This company, BlackBerry, has migrated from phones to cars. A Tesla is really a computer on wheels. What can we do? Vancouver is the North American capital for car sharing. Every single car share, whatever the names are, and we all know what their names are. If we demand that the cars that are car sharing co-ops that we become members of, instead of owning a car, we share a car. If that car is responsible in the manner that this movie presents that we should be, that's a step we can do. A smaller step, if we don't want a car, become a member of a tool library and ensure that the products that get onto the shelves of the tool library are responsible in the way that this movie suggests. Thank you.
May I respond, or do you want to take some more questions?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, those are excellent points, and I don't have responses on all of those points. I think some of them just stand for themselves. On the question of supply chains, I think this is really, really important, and this is where countries can take some steps ultimately to change the rules that apply in supply chains. It's a global issue, and it will require global or at least transnational solutions, but some countries have to get out in front of the game, and unfortunately Canada has been way behind the game in that area. But I think if I wanted to have some sort of takeaway messages for people to go off and lobby their MP or their MLA, one would have to do with international trade law. International trade law is based on this crazy premise that it doesn't matter how a product is produced. A product is a product is a product, whether it has slave labor, child labor, environmentally destructive practices, whether it's created sustainably or unsustainably. And I think that future international trade law has to allow governments to structure their trade rules to incorporate what are called processing and production methods. The way a product is produced matters for whether it ought to be sold in a particular market or the conditions under which it could be sold. And not just in international trade law, but also in government procurement. There was a passage was it in the movie or was it in Stephanie's remarks about government buyers? They are massive buyers of goods and services, and international rules about government procurement don't allow governments to discriminate amongst products based on, for example, the environmental impacts of their production. But to me, those are changes that need to be made. Another has to do with what we do about how Canadian companies behave overseas. And this is a really shameful story for being a Canadian. But I think we need to really push governments to change from a basic model or theory of the corporate veil to a theory of supply chain liability. So responsibility for a company's entire sphere of influence. If you have the ability to influence or control how actors behave up and down your value chain, then you ought to bear some legal responsibility for how they behave if you could have influenced it. And that involves both home states taking some regulatory responsibility for what their companies do abroad. And the federal government has just taken a very small step in that direction by establishing this new ombudsperson, which will be able to receive and hear complaints even about Canadian corporate conduct abroad without the consent of the company involved. This was actually a recommendation made more than a decade ago by the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee of Civil Society, Industry, and other stakeholders. And the Harper government at the time decided that they wouldn't adopt that recommendation instead in order for the old, what was the Corporate Social Responsibility Advisor Office called anyway? Counselor, it had to have the consent of the company against which the complaint was launched in order to investigate the complaint. How many complaints do you think were investigated? So it's a good step, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. And we also have to change the way we understand our court's jurisdiction. And we need to lobby for legal changes that would allow courts to take jurisdiction over complaints of human rights abuses and environmental abuses abroad that involve, say, Canadian companies or companies with Canadian operations, Canadian offices, or that sell products in Canada, rather than saying, well, that's an issue for the courts of the other country. And the last thing I wanted to say is you may or may not be aware of this, but right now, the flagship federal environmental law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, is under a review period, which the review itself has closed, but the government has not announced what it's going to do in response. And the CEPA, Canadian Environmental Protection Act, is the main federal law under which you can have uniform, harmonized federal regulation of toxic substances like the ones that are found in many electronic devices. And this is an opportunity to demand things like substitution principle. So putting regulatory mandates in place that will require the companies that use toxic substances to look for, and if they're available, to implement less toxic substitutes for those things. It's also an opportunity to put into place what people call reversal of the burden of proof. So the current Canadian system is that the government and opponents of particular substances bear the burden to show that they're unsafe, rather than the burden on industry wanting to introduce new chemicals into commerce to show that they are safe, which is now the approach in Europe for more toxic substances. The other thing, just fundamentally, the federal government has not gone anywhere near exercising its jurisdiction over toxic substances. It is a very reluctant actor in this area, leaving it mostly to the provinces, but the federal government has the power to regulate toxic substances, and I think citizens should be demanding that it actually exercise the power that it has.
I think we have time for one last question.
You just answered my question.
Oh, okay.
Can I just add one?
Yeah, you may.
I just your remarks once again reminded us of supply chains, and so one other thing I wanted to make sure people are aware of is right now there's an important study being done by a House of Commons committee known as the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. It's a study looking at child labor. But Amnesty and a number of other groups have used that as an opportunity to introduce into the process this notion that we do need some legislation in Canada obligating companies based, headquartered in Canada to do supply chain due diligence. So that's playing out right now. The committee hasn't finished its hearings. We don't yet have their report. But if this is of interest to you or anyone, you may want to get on the website, check out, it's the House of Commons Subcommittee on International Human Rights, and just sort of follow the progress of those hearings. Maybe go a little further and check whether by any chance your MP is a member of that subcommittee. If so, maybe she or he would appreciate a phone call from you, conveying that this is something you want to see them take up.
And you came up with some interesting ideas, but much of this goes in a circular argument, and it reminds me kind of the movie that was put out in Britain. Sorry, it was a TV series called Traffic, and then was made into a movie. There were the farmers that were poor, and they needed to grow the opium poppies. There were the dealers that were drawn by money, and then there was the end users. And it's much of the cyclical argument that we're hearing today. There's the child labor and the poor people from the farms in China that don't really have much choice. They're going for the jobs where they need to go in order to feed themselves. There are the manufacturers and obvious government officials that are being drawn by graft and by the need of money. There was an interesting comment that about the goldfish, that many of the manufacturers didn't like to see that because it meant that their profits, they were losing some profits there. And then there's the end consumers here. Well, we can't change much about the labor because they're impoverished, they need to eat, and there's only so much they can do. Graft and capitalism and the interest in money exists everywhere in the world. So we come back to the end user. What can we do about the end user? I'm looking at the age of the people on the panel here, and you know, you're not kids, and I think where it starts really is, yeah, look at my gray hair too, and where it starts is education. So how can we get a film like this documentary out and in the schools to the children so that they're educated from a young age? And that they're interested, and when they go to buy that iPhone, it's not just conspicuous consumption or because it's cool, but do I really need a new iPhone? What am I doing? What other educational methods are there? And can't remember one or the other on the end. I think it was the end fellow brought it up. You know, can we push for labeling, much like there's labeling on cigarettes? Labeling on items that are sold in the country, whether child labor was used to make it, you know, toxicity that was used to make it. Now, these have to be imposed by government. And it's all very nice to think that government may have ideals, but the reality is most government members are there and they want to keep getting voted in. So the only way that they're going to do these wonderful things is, again, if we start the education at the children and the consumers, and they push for the changes in their government to make the changes, and how do we get that information out there so that the consumers, which starts as kids, are pushing their representatives and their buying power to make the changes that are necessary, whether it be environmental, whether it be human rights, child labor, to make a difference. Any suggestions?
I'll start. I'm sure lots of people have much to say here. I couldn't agree with you more on pretty well everything you've laid out there, including very much, despite the fact that you're making pejorative comments about our age, the need to really reach and mobilize youth around these issues. So the work that Amnesty has been doing around the cobalt concerns that I highlighted in my opening remarks, there's been a key component that absolutely has been about taking this to schools, mobilizing youth groups, and it's taken off in a very big way at that level. And picking up on the labeling piece, recognizing that governments aren't doing the labeling, as part of the campaign, we're doing our own labeling, and we're giving people, and youth in particular, love these labels that you put on the back of your phone saying, warning, this phone may contain child labor. And it's a very effective, they're very large labels. I've actually been on public transit and looked over and seen someone across the way with one of those labels. That's a small contribution. Obviously that campaign hasn't gone viral all across the country, but I think things like that really do give us a way forward. I think your point about finding ways to try to give this film in particular some real distribution in the schools is key. I would say, though, from a human rights perspective, the only thing I would kind of maybe push back a little bit about is that it's only the end user that we really have the, I mean, that is certainly, that's, the power is in our hands. But I think the first piece of what you highlighted, there's a lot of really important and necessary advocacy around the human rights concerns facing impoverished communities in Congo, impoverished farmers in China, and I think we need to be very attentive to that side as well. The campaigning that needs to be done to push for more responsible international development in those communities, trade policy that will be beneficial and not punitive in those countries, and a whole variety of other measures that can ensure that the kid who's thinking about going into a cobalt mine in Congo, or the impoverished farmer who's going to take is going to ignore environmental contamination she's facing every day when she goes to work, that there's other options and a brighter future for them.
And I know we're short on time, so I won't say much more, but I just wanted to emphasize that too, that I caution us getting caught on the sort of consumer activism end of things, or thinking that we only approach the issue as the sort of end user. That the things that we saw in that documentary, I mean, it's really, we could take them back and have a documentary done in Victorian England around the mills, and we'd be dealing with very similar issues, mines in Appalachia, right? And the only real counterforce historically to capitalist development and exploitation has been the organization of workers, right? To contest production and the way production is carried out, the way distribution is carried out. So we can think about it even in a more contemporary example, logistical workers, dock workers who have refused to handle goods because of the way that they've been produced. Now, once that sort of organizing, and those things tend to get a really quick response, right? When dock workers say, no, we're not unloading the bins that come in, right? We can see the power of workers there, and I think we really have to emphasize that too. Neoliberalism and globalization, the new phase of global capitalism, started off, it launched with a tax on unions. And that was very specific, whether we're talking about Thatcher in England, whether we're talking about Reagan in the US, it started with a tax on unions for that very specific reason, that's the real counterpower. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that. And we have a hell of a lot of work to do. I mean, if you look at unionization rates in the US, right, that Reagan revolution was real. You know, unionization rates in the US down like below 10%, right? And in Canada, partly because of the public sector, it's a bit higher, but we're still looking at, 30% sort of range, right?
Yeah, and I would just add, although I share your, your sense of how difficult these challenges are, it is useful to remember that we have had progress in the last 100 years on the supply end of things. If you think about labor, environmental, and human rights conditions in factories 100 years ago, we have had labor standards, we have universal human rights, we have modern environmental legislation. So I think it is possible for these things to change. But of course, we need to remember also that progress is never secure. You have to continue to fight and consolidate victories that you thought were certain in face of the sorts of things that you were just mentioning. But I was also going to say that I agree with you about the focus on young people and education. I may not be that young, but I have teenage kids. And I think there are probably a lot of parents and grandparents in the room. We have some influence over our children and grandchildren's use of electronic devices, either by way of example or by way of parental responsibility, and I think we should exercise that. I also think that in the schools, it's not the solution is not so much showing films like this in schools, although I think that's an important part of it. I think it is mandating getting the kids off their devices and out of doors. So investments in outdoor education, many of which were cut back or canceled in the 1990s during the neoliberal phases, which we are still very much in certain circumstances. And I just wanted to leave one final thought, which is we've had more than 50 years of opportunity to educate our children in ecological science and environmental, sort of modern environmental consciousness, and this is where we've gotten to. I think what we want to do now is educate our children in Indigenous laws and institutions, because we have the example of societies that have interacted sustainably with their environments for millennia, and we know very little about what lessons they might have for us as a society. And so I think mandatory education in Indigenous law and Indigenous culture is important as well.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists, Stepan, Jeff, and Alex.